Hey everyone, welcome. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about block level elements, inline elements, headings, paragraphs, and a few other little elements that I want to get us started with before we start talking about lists, which would be in the next video. But to get us started, it's really important that we understand the difference between a block level element and an inline element, especially before we move into our next module where we start working with CSS. So to illustrate that, I'm going to outline what some of the key differences are between block level elements and inline. Starting with block level. A block level element is going to render content on a new line. It will always render that content left justified by default. It renders content to expand the entire width of its container, and it's meant to structure the main parts of the page by dividing up our content. Now an inline element, sometimes we call that text level or phrasing element. It doesn't render our content to a new line. It actually renders in the flow of our text by default, and it only takes up the amount of space of the content in which it surrounds. And our inline elements are meant to differentiate parts of our content or to give it sort of a particular function or a meaning. And mostly, inline elements will comprise of just one or a few more words. Let's go ahead and get started. First, going into Blackboard, you can download the Week 4 demo file that's in the Read folder. And I'm going to go ahead and open mine up into VS Code if you would like to do the same. So I'm going to go ahead and open the index.html file, but I'm also going to open up my previewer. And remember, live preview is over here in the top right hand corner. And then I'm going to collapse my Explorer window to give myself the most amount of room that I can on my page. So if we were to look at this HTML file, this index.html, we should be able to recognize a lot of the key components. For example, our doc type, where we're actually defining that this is an HTML5 document. We can also see our root element, which is telling the browser that this is an HTML document. And therefore it starts at this opening HTML tag and it ends down here at our closing HTML tag. We have our head element, which is being used to contain data about our document, like our meta element and our title element. You can see the body element, and that's what's actually being displayed in our web browser, everything between our opening body and our closing body. We also have several headings from H1 to H2 to H3, and these are helping to define our headings for the entire page. And then finally, the main building blocks of a lot of pages in website development is the paragraph element, and you can see we have a number of those on our page. Okay, let's focus on the headings for just a few moments. There's a difference between a head element, a header element, and headings elements. They have very similar names, but they definitely have different functions. For example, the head element never renders content onto our page. A header element describes the very top of our document or the head of it. And headings are used to indicate what the hierarchy is of our page, kind of like an outline that you would have in a Word document. Now, headings are considered block level elements, so they automatically render the content onto a new line and they add a space around the content. And because it's block level, it automatically expands to the entire width of that element's container. Our documents will always start with an H1 element and are going to work in numerical order down. We can't skip a heading from like H1 to H4 because doing so is a violation of accessibility. Every single document that we create should have one H1 element in it. After all, every page really only has one main theme. And screen readers are going to use page headings to scan and navigate the page as needed. Our search engines are also going to examine the headings in an algorithm to determine that site's content, so when we use our headings correctly, we're actually improving the Google search results. So whatever you do when you're making headings, don't change the headings just to fit the size of the text. If you want to change the size of your text, you should do that using CSS, and we'll learn how to do that in Module 2. Let's focus next on paragraph elements. Now, a paragraph element is going to be a very common building block of all of our web pages. We've already used them in our demos and our exercises, and paragraphs are also a block level element, so they appear on a new line and they extend to the entire width of the document window or to that parent's container by default. Paragraphs can contain inline elements like images or spans, but they definitely can't contain any other block level element, and that's one of our course standards that we covered in week 2. HTML validators don't actually flag a missing closing paragraph tag, so it's really important that developers are vigilant and make sure that they include that closing tag so that it's there for consistency and clarity. This is also one of our course standards. The next one I'm going to talk about is the horizontal rule element. You might often hear this called a thematic break. This is used to break up sections of our page visually. It's an empty or self-closing element, and it doesn't contain any content, so it doesn't need to have a closing tag. And even though we can use a horizontal rule to make that line appear on our page, it's oftentimes much better to create that line using CSS, but we won't get to that till Module 2. So for right now, let's go ahead and add our first horizontal rule underneath our H1 element. So I'll go into my document, and after my H1, I'm going to insert a horizontal rule. And because shortcuts are going to be our thing, we're going to use that tab button to go ahead and auto-insert the correct syntax for this horizontal rule. And notice on my web page that I now have this line being drawn across my page right beneath my H1 or my first heading for web browsers. And because it doesn't contain any content after the opening HR tag, we don't need to worry about that closing HR tag. There isn't one. Again, this is also called a self-closing or an empty element. Another example of a self-closing or empty element is called the line break element. And even though it's better to use CSS to create extra space, we can also add space in our HTML by inserting these line breaks. So we're going to create 2 line breaks after our nav element, which is short for navigation, but we want to have them before our closing header tag. But before I can do that, I just realized that I have a typo in my header. I can see that I have an opening header tag here, but my closing header tag is missing the / to indicate that this is the close of our header. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in right now. That's better. Now back to those break tags. So I'll go ahead and I'll insert my 2 break elements, and I'm going to use the tab button to make this work go faster. Notice that it spaces some extra lines in between our navigation, which is displayed on the page, and the next item down, which is the second heading, Google Chrome. Alright, the last one I'm going to cover real quick is called the pre-formatted text element, or the pre-element. Now the pre-element is going to tell the browser to render any space or line breaks. And before, when I talked about the browser and white space, we looked at how the browser ignores specific items, such as extra line returns, or tabs, or additional character spaces. But what if we wanted the browser to do exactly what we said? For example, right after my Google Chrome paragraph here, what if I wanted to have my text broken apart in a very different way, with some extra spaces and a few extra line breaks? If I wrapped this with a pre-formatted text element, watch what happens to my web page where it says some extra spaces and line breaks. Now that I have my pre-formatted text element on the page, you'll notice that the browser respected what it was that I wanted to have displayed. It's going to display text exactly as I had it, with all of my tabs, all of my spaces, and everything else. Now the default for this is display that content in a monospace font, so it has a very consistent width, and that just makes it easier for the browser and for you. I'm going to go ahead and remove that though, because it's not part of what I really want to talk about, which is going to be lists, which I'm going to cover in my next video. Now if you have any questions on any of the content that I just covered, please don't hesitate to ask.